Okay, hi everybody, good to see you. And I thought today, as usual, we would talk about the Parsha that we're going to read this coming Shabbos. And if you follow the Torah reading, you know that we have finished 3 Chumashim of the 5, and we're beginning the 4th book of the Torah, which in Hebrew goes by the word Bamidbar, but in English it is called Numbers. Now, interestingly enough, the term Numbers actually corresponds with the rabbinic designation of the 4th Chumash, which is Chumash HaPikudim, the Chumash of the census, or censai, I imagine would be the plural of the Latin. And that is because the book of Bamidbar begins with a census of the Jewish people, and towards the end of the book, there is a second census of the Jewish people. Now, interestingly, these two countings are counting 2 different population bases, because what happened is the census at the beginning of the 4th book is a counting of the Jews who left Egypt at the age of 20 and up. Below 20 you were not counted. But in the course of the 40 years in the desert, that generation died out. And the second census, towards the end of the Chumash, talks about the generation that will be entering Eretz Yisrael. They are the new generation, the people who either were under 20 at the time of the Exodus or were born in the desert. So 2 different groups of people are being counted. Interestingly enough, the totals of both counts are exactly the same, although the individual tribes differ, meaning in the course of the 40 years, some tribes had a great increase in population, some had a decrease in population, but it is fascinating, and it must be divinely intended, that the 2 numbers match. Today, when we look at that first census, this is 1 month after the dedication of the Mishkan. Now again, to give you a little chronology, the Jewish people left Mitzrayim obviously on Paysach, first day of Paysach, 15th of Nisan. I mean, that's why it is the first day of Paysach, because that's when we left. In the Torah, the years change in Nisan, not Tishrei. Every Nisan is another year. So the Mishkan was constructed Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the first day of the new 2nd year, and the census was done 1 month later, Rosh Chodesh Iyar. So this is 12 and a half months, 12 months and 2 weeks after they left Egypt. They are counted. Now, Rashi points out that there actually was an earlier census in the Torah that is not recorded, and that is after the sin of the golden calf, when God wanted to destroy the Jewish people and Moshe prayed, and he comes down on Yom Kippur with the tablets, which signify God's forgiveness. There's actually a chicken and an egg problem. The sin of the golden calf was forgiven on Yom Kippur. The issue is, did Yom Kippur become a day of forgiveness? Because that's when God forgave the sin of the golden calf? Or did God forgive the sin of the golden calf because it was Yom Kippur? Meaning, is the forgiveness of the golden calf a result of Yom Kippur? Or is it the reason for Yom Kippur? Okay, we could debate this, we could discuss that, but be it as it may, Moshe comes down on Yom Kippur with the 2nd tablets. The first tablets had already been broken. And immediately afterwards, the day after Yom Kippur, the Jewish people are commanded to build a Mishkan, build a tabernacle for God. And as part of that process, they are commanded to give a half shekel, which would be melted down and made into the sockets of the Mishkan. And in Parshas Pikudei, the end of the book of Exodus, we are given the total of the shekels there. And if you add up the shekels, you will see a population of there were 300,000 plus whole shekels, so multiply it by 2 for half, you get the same 603,000 people. In other words, the same population base was counted within a span of 7 months. There was the counting right after Yom Kippur through the half shekel contribution. And then just 7 months later, 1 month after the Mishkan is dedicated, the same people are counted again. Right? That's not the same as the second count after 40 years. That's a different population group. What is the purpose of counting the same group of people twice within the span of 7 months. It's the same group of people. Now, Rashi does raise another interesting question, and that is, how could the two counts be identical? You only get counted when you have your 20th birthday, meaning until you have your 20th birthday, you're not counted. Now, in the 7 months between Yom Kippur and Iyar, anybody that was born between Yom Kippur and Iyar, that was going from their 19th to their 20th year, would become 1 year older. So shouldn't that mean that the second count would be larger than the first count, unless you assume that there were deaths that were equal to the people that reached their 20th birthday? And yet we have a tradition that nobody died in the desert except for the specific divine punishments that are mentioned. Plenty of people died in the desert, obviously, but nobody died naturally. And since there is no event that indicated anybody died between Iyar and Yom Kippur, our assumption is that nobody died. So how could the two population groups be the same in 7 months? Didn't anybody have their 20th birthday? So Rashi gives a very fascinating answer. Rashi says, to define how old you are, everybody was given a uniform birth date of Rosh Hashanah, meaning you didn't get 1 year older halachically when you had your birthday. You became 1 year older when Rosh Hashanah came, which actually means that if somebody was born right after Rosh Hashanah, then a whole year later they would become one. And if somebody was born 2 days before Rosh Hashanah, they would be one. So two people who were separated by almost a year would actually have the same birthday. And from then on, it's lockstep, every Rosh Hashanah. And since between Yom Kippur and Iyar, there is no Rosh Hashanah, then anybody who was not yet 20 would not become 20 till the following Tishrei. And that's why the counts were allowed to be the same. I understand that racehorses are dated the same way, that racehorses have a uniform January 1st birthday. And I believe that at one point, I don't know if they do it today, China did that with their citizens. They wanted everyone to have the same birthday. That made records easier. So everybody was assigned a birthday of January 1. According to Rashi, everybody was assigned a birthday of Rosh Hashanah. Okay, so that's a very interesting point. But to go back to the first question, what is the purpose of counting the same population base within 7 months? Same group of people. Yotzei Mitzrayim, those who left Egypt. So Rashi gives us a very short answer to that question as well. And Rashi says, Derech Chiba, multiple countings is an expression of God's love for the Jewish people. Just like a miser might count his money or count his jewels over and over and over again because he loves just holding on to the jewels, so too God enjoys counting the Jewish people over and over and over again. It's a sign of his love. Whenever there's a pivotal event in our history, he wants to count us. So after the golden calf, he wants to count the survivors. And when the Mishkan is built and God puts his divine presence into the world, he wants to count. So Rashi simply says repetitive countings. There's no informational need for it, but it's chiba. Chiba means love, affection, care. But I'd like to suggest to you perhaps there's a deeper meaning here that's very interesting. That is, it is true that the Jews were counted after Yom Kippur by giving the half shekel. And the Jews were counted 7 months later after the Mishkan was built. Yeah. But there was a difference in the way they were counted. And that difference might be very telling. The first count was really an anonymous count. People simply dropped coins in a box. I don't know what the receptacle was. And Moshe tabulated the population by counting the coins. There was no notion of individuality. There was no notion of Moshe connecting to a particular person. It's really a mass counting with no individuation, no uniqueness. It was a count of anonymity. By contrast, the count 7 months later is a little different. And the exact difference is not entirely clear. I will note that it does not mention the indirect counting of shekels in Bamidbar, which may suggest that people were counted by head, meaning you individually are counted. But both Rashi and Ramban do say that Bamidbar was also through shekels, indirect counts. So Rashi and Ramban put that in. But even then it's different, because the indirect shekel count after the sin of the golden calf was anonymous. I dropped my coin in the box and they just counted the coins. Here, I gave my coin directly to Moshe. Moshe matched the face to the coin. And Ramban has a very beautiful point. It was vitally important for Moshe and for each Jew to actually meet Moshe at least once in their lives. If you think about this, Moshe was the greatest prophet who ever lived, who ever will live. But how many Jews of that generation ever had the chance to even talk to Moshe Rabbeinu? He was a scary figure. Remember that his very face shone with the radiance of God. That actually means, except when he was communicating divine commandments, he walked around with a veil over his face. I mean, imagine this. You're playing basketball with your kids outside your desert tent or whatever it is, and all of a sudden this spooky, ghostly figure walks by. It must have been pretty scary, actually. Like, in and out, Moshe Rabbeinu. So if you had a shaila, if you mixed your milchik, your dairy spoon, and your fleishik bowl, you didn't ask Moshe those questions. There were other people who answered those questions. So Moshe Rabbeinu, precisely because of his greatness, his unfathomable greatness, was by definition distant from the people. He didn't know that many people, and very few people knew him. Unlike Aaron. Aaron, his older brother, was actually very different in that way. Aaron was a man of the people. Aaron, Pirkei Avos tells us, was a lover of peace, a pursuer of peace. If husband and wife were fighting, Aaron would try to make shalom. So a lot of people knew Aaron. In fact, Chazal say that more people mourned Aaron's death than even Moshe's death. Because Moshe was a paradigm of unbelievable spiritual greatness. But it wasn't accessible to us. So says the Ramban, it was very important that once in your life, you got to kind of shake Moshe's hand by giving him this coin. Hi, I'm Avraham, I'm Yitzchak, whatever it is. And it's also important for Moshe that once in his life, he got to see you. Because just because you're the leader of Klal Yisrael doesn't mean you're not the leader and the guide of each individual person as well. And therefore, the second census was a census of individuality. I give Moshe the coin. I meet him. I see him. Again, we don't have a transcript, but some words were exchanged. I think sometimes just as a human picture, if you've ever seen the YouTube videos of Lubavitcher Rebbe, when people would walk by to get $1, used to give $1, right? So, typically the exchanges were very short because there were a lot of people. And Moshe had more, 600,000 people Moshe had. But still, people walked away feeling a connection. They felt they were connected to something holy. So that's already one difference between the first census and the second census. And there's another difference, which is more explicit even, and that is in the first census, we know how many Jews there were from 20 up, 603,000. But we don't have a tribal breakdown. Reuven, Shimon, right? We don't know, because after all, if all you have is a box of coins, you don't know which tribe it came from. By contrast, in the book of Bamidbar, not only do we have a total, but we also have subtotals for each of the tribes. So, what do we have so far? The Jewish people were counted from the age of 20 up, 7 months apart. They were counted after the sin of the golden calf, after Yom Kippur, by the medium of half shekels, and then they were counted 7 months later, 1 month after the tabernacle, Rosh Chodesh Iyar. Same people were counted again. Difference is that the first count was anonymous. All there was a tabulation of the coins. The second count, you gave your coin to Moshe. And the second difference is the first counting did not have a tribal breakdown, and the second counting had a tribal breakdown. So, with all of this information, what do we make of this? Why would there be a need for counting, and why would there be a need for counting in two different ways? All of us know the idea that the whole mitzvah of giving the half shekel, by the way, the half shekel is worth a lot more. Don't think about the Israeli half shekel. A half shekel in terms of silver weight would be something like $50 today. That's what it would be. It was not the 3 cents that a half shekel is worth in Israeli currency. But be it as it may, all of us know there's a very famous thought that why are we counted through a half shekel? Because a half is incomplete unless you join it with another half. It's only a half. And that reminds us that we alone are not complete unless we connect to each other. There's a very famous, well-known idea about the half a shekel. So the whole idea of counting is a symbol of community, togetherness, needing each other, having to stick together. Achdus, right? All of that is good. But when we think about what does it mean to be one community? What does it mean to have achdus? What does it mean to be together? There are actually two models of achdus that one might posit. One might be called the melting pot, and the other might be called the salad bowl. Now, the melting pot, which was the predominant model of cultural integration, certainly in the United States until the middle of the 20th century, and it was also the predominant model in the early decades of the State of Israel, in the late 40s, 50s, and until the 60s. The melting pot basically says the following. In order to bring together people with different cultures and different backgrounds and different histories, we need to kind of obliterate their differences and forge a common identity. You know, if you were a Hispanic coming to the United States in the early 1900s, and you went to a high school, and you requested Spanish language instruction, they would look at you as crazy. The basic idea was, hey, you come to America, you got to learn English. That's the language. We're not going to make accommodations for all of these different cultures. You got to become one. Yeah. We'll call that a melting pot. A melting pot means you take all the different ingredients and you boil them together since they're no longer recognizable. Yeah, cholent is, again, this is not the most appetizing analogy. You know, cholent starts off very distinct. You have barley and beans and meats and potatoes. That's wonderful. That's Shabbos cholent. But if you have leftover cholent, if you are unfortunate enough to have leftover cholent, by Sunday night or Monday or Tuesday, I don't recommend this at all, at that point, the ingredients are going to be unrecognizable glop. It'll just kind of melt into each other. That is the notion of the melting pot. The melting pot tries to achieve unity by obliteration of difference, creating sameness. In fact, that is really part of why Israel had a universal draft. You know, the reason why David Ben-Gurion, who was kind of the George Washington of the State of Israel, the founding prime minister, was so keen that Israel be a state of universal military service, it was not so much for security purposes. It was the notion of creating a common cultural framework in which everybody had the same experiences, and then they could function with unity. And in fact, the big debates in the religious community about military service are precisely because they don't want that model. They don't want the model of total cultural assimilation. They want to retain their own identity, meaning the issue is not one of military security. The issue is largely one, again, I'm not expressing opinions on this, I'm just describing. The issue of army service is largely one of cultural assimilation, And there are those that feel we have to have that cultural assimilation. Otherwise, we will simply have a multicultural society of people not talking to each other with hostilities, and therefore we need the melting pot. Now that's one model of unity. A unity that is premised on obliteration of differences. Now, in the mid to late 20th century, and I'm not even talking about Torah yet. You'll see I will connect it to Torah in a minute. The model of melting pot was replaced with something that goes by different names, but multiculturalism is one of them. In fact, I see prophetically that Rabbi Gottlieb is going to talk about multicultural. Oh, he did already? Okay, so I might be repeating. Forgive me if I am. Multiculturalism basically says that each culture and each group should be allowed to preserve its ways. Now, the problem with multiculturalism is that sometimes it results in anarchy, a lack of community, a lack of connection. That is largely the issue with the Muslim populations in many, many countries, including European countries, France, Germany, England, in which Spain, in which you have large groups of Muslims who refuse to accept the cultural norms of their society. And as a result, sometimes, again, I don't mean to paint a negative brush on everybody, but sometimes engage in violence. And in the United States, multiculturalism also has its problems in which each group basically refuses to acknowledge the legitimacy of the other groups, whether it's Black Lives Matter, kind of vis-a-vis the Caucasian, the white community, or whether it's the racial aspects, the neo-Nazis within the Caucasian community. Basically, every group maintains its own separate identity, and as a result, do not function as a community. So, in a negative way, multiculturalism causes schisms, factionalism, but in a positive way, it can actually lead to a higher level of unity, a unity that is not based on obliteration of difference, but a unity that celebrates diversity and different ways of approaching life, in which each person's perception gets enriched by understanding the perceptions of others. And there are many, many metaphors that can describe the beauty of a unity that is premised on accepting divergent viewpoints. You can call it a salad bowl, right? So if the melting pot is exemplified by cholent on Wednesday, look at a salad bowl, assuming, right, you have lettuce, tomatoes, olives, peppers, mushrooms, whatever you put in, sprouts, whatever you want to put in. So what do you have? You have different colors, different textures, different types of taste, sweet versus spicy, or whatever it would be. And together they create a whole that is greater than the sum of individual parts. So you can have a unity that's based on melting pot, and you can have a unity that is based on salad bowl. And the salad bowl analogy can have a lot of applications other than gastronomic. We could talk about tapestries. The beauty of a tapestry are the different colors of all of the different threads. The beauty of a mosaic. The beauty of a symphony is that you have different notes. Imagine if you would just play the same musical note over and over again. That wouldn't sound like music, really, right? What is it? Music? Divergent notes. The beauty of a garden. The Medrash tells us that although there are gardens that only have one flower, right, there might be a garden of 10,000 red roses, which may be beautiful, but for most of us, for most people, the beauty of a garden lies in the diversity of flowers. Now, granted, that may be a more difficult unity to attain, because once you're creating a society where people march to the beat of their own drummer, and people maintain their own cultures, their own norms, their own mores, it is harder to find the common ground that brings people together. But ultimately, if you can do it, if you can navigate that, you have a richer, deeper, textured fabric of what a community is. A community that celebrates the fact that God made every human being different, with different talents, different abilities, different personalities. And we need to combine all of these different approaches in order to create true unity and ultimately a communion with God. So here is my suggestion. By describing how people are counted in two different ways, the Torah is alluding to these two different communal structures. The first count in the aftermath of the golden calf is the melting pot community. In the melting pot community, we don't care who you are as an individual. You are simply a faceless, anonymous member of a society that has to get things done. We don't talk about tribes, Reuven, Shimon. We're the Jewish people. We have a job. So, minyan number one, counting number one, is community based on melting pot. Jewish community based on melting pot. Minyan number two is very different. You're no longer an anonymous, faceless person who just drops his coin in the bag. You are a Reuven, you are a Shimon. And not only that, tribes are important. Now people wonder, it's very, very clear in the Torah that tribal affiliation was a very big deal. We're not even conscious of this day. We don't know our tribe, except unless you're a Levi, Kohen. But a person might, tribes were so important in the Torah. Every tribe had its own nasi, its own head. Every tribe had its flag. Every tribe had its designated place in the desert. And most importantly, in Eretz Yisrael, every tribe got its portion. Reuven, Shimon, Yehuda. Now you may wonder, why are tribes important? Isn't the only thing that matters that we're Jews? I mean, we have enough that we fight about without tribal affiliation. So now we're going to say, hey, I'm from Yehuda, I'm better than you. What is the purpose of making such a big deal about the 12 tribes of Israel, of which we're not even so conscious today? The answer is exactly this. Our sages tell us every tribe had its own spiritual personality. Every tribe had a unique approach in the way it served God, within the common framework of Torah we're talking about. I'm not talking about not keeping the Torah, but within the framework of Torah. Each tribe represented its own unique approach. So the concept of tribes is what God is saying. I don't want a monolithic society. I want a community of diversity of talent, diversity of approach, different ways of looking at things. It is in the symbiotic relationship of all of these different elements that beauty and truth emerges. So the first count is melting pot. The second count is salad bowl. But the question is, so which one is it? I mean, why do you have two counts? I mean, what does God want? Does God want the first model? Or does God want the second model? So here is the suggestion. The first model represents Klal Yisrael in a state of crisis. After the golden calf, our very lives were in the balance. God wanted to abrogate the covenant. And God wanted to make a private deal with Moshe. Moshe turned it down. And Moshe had to beg and plead and pray. We were in deep, deep trouble. Deep, deep trouble. It's kind of like after the Holocaust. How do you rebuild a Jewish nation after a devastating tragedy? So the lesson of that is that there are going to be moments of crisis in which your job is not to march to the beat of your own drummer, not to focus on your individual agenda, but kind of put aside your individuality for the greater good of the nation. Okay? There are times in life in which individuality is not the agenda. After the Holocaust, when the Jewish people had to rebuild, a lot of people, a lot of men, let's say, would just marry the first woman, they bumped into. Or the first woman would take the first man because they said, we just have to get married and have children. They weren't looking for love. They were not looking for romance. They were not looking for passion. They had a sense of duty. They had a sense of responsibility. And they carried it out. Interestingly enough, by the way, a lot of those marriages turned out to be wonderful and loving. But it wasn't like they had great romance before the marriage. So, in the aftermath of the Chet HaEgel, don't be so focused on your particular thing. Give it up for the greater good. But the lesson of the second counting is that that's only temporary. When you're talking about the long-term constitution of Am Yisrael. We don't want monolithic. We don't want homogeneity, to be homogeneous. We want there to be diversity. We want there to be difference. And therefore, the movement from the first counting to the second counting is the transition from the short-term melting pot that is necessary in moments of crisis to the long-term mature society that celebrates diversity and difference. Now, my words can be misunderstood, and I need to absolutely clarify this. Unfortunately, just like the word gay, when I was a kid, used to just mean happy. I mean, that's what it means in English, but today it's taken on another meaning. It's been hijacked, so to speak. So you can't say, I feel very gay today. You look at me in a funny way. So a lot of words have been hijacked by society. I talk about diversity. I talk about difference. Gee, I'm sounding like somebody on a college campus. And diversity and difference, as you know, is generally associated with gay, lesbian, transgender, and the like. I don't mean that. Now, again, I'm not here to knock anybody. As I say, I have deep respect, and I believe the Torah has deep respect for all human beings and people who have difficult struggles in life. It's not my role to look down or even be critical, and I'm not being critical. But all I'm saying is that when I use the word diversity, I am not referring to that. I am referring to diversity within the framework of the Torah. And that is, we have to recognize that indeed, to become a religious Jew, there is a lot of conformity. One cannot deny it. We all keep Shabbos. We're all supposed to keep kosher. Men wear tefillin. We daven 3 times a day. Like everybody seems to be doing the same thing. But you have to understand that that creates the common framework of the community. That's the framework. That's the scaffolding. But within the context of that framework, God wants each of us to serve him as an individual, to bring him our talents, our ability, our intelligence, our creativity. That is why we have Ashkenazim and Sephardim and many types of Ashkenazim, many types of Sephardim, and many different types of Hasidim. People sometimes say, why can't all these Jews just do the same thing? The answer is, we want a garden with many flowers. It is not. Now, again, the downside is that sometimes these differences turn into acrimony and hatred and fighting and rivalry, and that is bad. The Second Temple was destroyed because of hatred, needless hatred and polarization among Jews. So that can easily become bad. But provided there is this mutual respect, the diversity that can exist within a Torah society, like different tribes, is not a chisaron, it is not a lack, it is not something wrong. It is a source of strength, vitality, beauty. And the same is true for not just congregational groups, but for every individual. You bring to the Jewish community a unique talent, whatever your talent is. It could be music, poetry, sports, political activism, whatever it would be. The Torah's goal is not to have you squelch your individuality, but to give you a framework within which you can exercise your individuality. And the lesson of the second census is that we need community and we need unity, but not at the cost of homogeneity and not at the cost of sameness, conformity, and the like. And that is the transition from the melting pot census, which is sometimes necessary in times of great crisis, to the salad bowl census, which is the higher and more mature level of what a Jewish community is. Now, this has many, many applications. This is also a message for our educational system. You know, Shlomo HaMelech says, King Solomon says in the book of Proverbs, Chanoch l'nar al pi darko, train a child according to their way. And that means every person has their own way of learning, their own connection. And far too often, usually because a school by definition is not a one-to-one ratio of teacher to student, we kind of have a one-size-fits-all type of educational approach where everybody's expected to be lockstep and there's no tolerance and understanding of different learning styles, different types of intelligence, right? The educational system, and this is true in Torah and non-Torah, but in Torah as well, only respects one type of intelligence, kind of what's called the analytical intelligence and the like. But there is emotional intelligence, the capacity of empathy. There may be kids who are not automatically gifted in textual learning, either because of a learning disability or just generally, but they might be extremely gifted in their emotional understanding of other people. But those talents are not acknowledged. They're not valued. And a kid goes through life thinking they're a failure because they're not successful in getting A's in either math or Gemara, whatever the subject is. And part of the idea of recognizing that communities have to also be attuned to individuality is to recognize that children too are very different from each other and have to be approached in that way. In that way, raising a child is not about remaking the person. It's about uncovering what is already there, giving the child the tools to uncover the beauty that is already there. In fact, I often say that that's why the symbol of our covenant with God, which is the circumcision, is you uncover, you reveal. Meaning what you're doing is you're not putting something on the kid. You're uncovering what is already latent within the child's personality. Okay, so I hope that this gives you a little bit of insight in terms of how a community and how a family should ideally be constructed.